I'm Sandra Petrulionis. I've been at Penn State, Altoona for 25 years. I came here in 1996. I'm a distinguished professor of English and American Studies, and my specialization is 19th century American literature and literary history, primarily Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, and especially Henry David Thoreau and other writers on the subject of reform, anti-slavery, abolitionism. And so that includes other Concord authors as well, Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and little-known people who were very much anti-slavery activists in town. So I've been very interested in how Thoreau's environmental ethic and natural history writings have connected to his reputation and writings as a social activist and a reform figure who's certainly still important in our society today for the concept of civil disobedience.
I'm Rebecca Strzelec, Distinguished Professor of Visual Arts at Penn State Altoona, where I've been teaching and working since 2002. I'm a visual artist who's mostly making wearable objects through technology, specifically 3D printing, 3D modeling, 3D scanning. I also co-direct the Center for Additive Manufacturing and Printing at Penn State Altoona. Thank you for coming here with me today on this very gray, threatening of rain April day.
Perfect April day. Coolest month.
It sure is. It does swing quite a bit. I think where I want to start our conversation is kind of where we started our friendship. Mm-hmm. I was lucky enough that you invited me to tag along on a field trip that you designed for your students in a very specific kind of class. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it was. It was honors freshman composition, English 30, and it was spring of 2005. And the entire class was taught around a theme of Walden. And so as the students, again, an honors group of students, so it was a very small cohort, I think 15 students in the class. And we were reading Walden one chapter at a time throughout the semester, along with the things that you normally teach and learn in a composition class. Principles of good writing. At the same time, we were looking at Thoreau's rhetorical techniques and noticing what he was doing. Midway through the semester, I had the idea that I'd love a field trip to Walden and Concord, if that could be budgeted, which miraculously and wonderfully it was. And I can't remember if you heard about the trip from me or if it was hallway, because our offices are across the hall from one another. But I remember you approached me and said, how would you like to include an artistic component to your Thoreau field trip? Because Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in Western Massachusetts could be on the way.
Sort of.
We took a different route.
Yes. We add a few hours, but it worked out well.
It did.
When we got to the pond and we're walking around it and we arrived to the area where the cabin was, the students were they were buzzing. They couldn't contain it in the fact that this thing that they had been looking at so closely is in existence. Exactly. And I think art museums do that for myself and my students as well.
Do you remember the other beautiful thing that happened, which was completely unplanned by me? We were there the weekend of Patriots' Day in Massachusetts.
Right.
And so the other thing we were able to do was march our students, those who were interested, out to Lexington, next door to Concord, on the night that Paul Revere made his midnight ride. And so we were among the crowd of several standing in the cold, it was cold, Lexington Street, and we heard the clippity-clop on the cobblestones of an enactor, historical enactor, yelling that the British were coming.
But it becomes performance art in a way too, right? And so there's this kind of cross-pollination of ideas, and I love that because I think where we started with was talking about our offices are across the hall from one another, and that's unusual.
It is.
You know, in most colleges, universities, you're kind of grouped by discipline, and there's some kind of really cool things that happen at Penn State Altoona because I'm across the hall from you and vice versa. This probably wouldn't have occurred if
No, I don't know that we
Yeah.
would have gotten to know each other at all. Casually, here and there, in meetings and committees,
but not
enough that you would have had any idea my class was
Right.
taking a field trip
Right.
that particular weekend.
and then arriving here over 15 years later
Right.
in this very
Exactly.
spot. And this very spot is special
It is.
for a lot of reasons. Why don't you tell us where we're sitting?
We are sitting in Penn State, Altoona's very own, proud to own, replica of Thoreau's cabin, 10 by 15, constructed by students, environmental studies and English students, in the fall of 2011. And that was part of a class, Environmental Studies 297, directed and taught by Ian Marshall, a professor of English and Environmental Studies, who has just recently retired. And when the campus purchased the property, the 40 acres that were on Seminar Forest, I think it was always Ian's idea to do something Thoreauvian here, but he wasn't sure what. And his office also was near mine, and we talked about it a lot. And he broached the idea of, why don't we build his cabin, to a suspicious administrator who became convinced. Especially when we found, or he found through his research, that a company existed, New England Nests, that actually provides replica kits. And so we didn't have to become, Ian and his students didn't have to become expert construction managers and builders, and it could conceivably be done in one semester. And so after getting all the permits and necessary permissions and so forth, that's what they did. And the company even sent a representative down to train, and he was part of the initial setup and giving all kinds of very needed help, expertise on the process. But they built it over the fall semester of 2011, and I think ribbon cutting was, the very start of the next semester. In English and environmental studies students, about a dozen of them. And one of my favorite stories when Ian talks about this project is that he's very proud to say, we were reading Walden at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so we were learning about the process of Thoreau's art and how he considered the building itself of his own shelter to be the most important thing he could contribute to what he wanted to do at the pond, which was to have an experiment in deliberate living. But Ian says, in the classroom, I'm the expert, I'm the literary scholar, and we were reading the text and so forth. And there were always a couple of students who were a little less engaged than others. And he said, once we were out here and started the building process, one of those two less engaged in the classroom students turned out to be a construction manager.
Oh, perfect.
During the summers. And so he would take over, and he was the one to draw up the plans better than they were and to make sure people were on task and to allocate division of labor. And Ian said, I'm standing back, I can't even use a hammer without hitting my thumb. And he was so delighted that student had a role that he could step into, but also that Ian was really in the background, that when they were out here and out of the traditional literary classroom, he was no longer the expert at all.
Can you talk a little bit about what shelter meant to Thoreau and why 10 by 15? Why so? What would be perceived as modest? Like, why not more? Why not bigger?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the place in Walden that he describes having the tightly shingled cabin, 10 by 15, 8-foot posts. And I don't remember that he's ever given a rationale for why exactly that size, but he knew that he wanted 2 windows. He wanted, what we did not do in this cabin that does differ from Thoreau's cabin, is that we have a loft, and they wanted that in here for storage. Mm-hmm. And Thoreau had a chimney and a hearth for winter heat and cooking, and we don't have that. And then he had his root cellar behind the cabin. But he wanted a bed, a desk, 3 chairs, and that was basically it. So, that is the size that apparently he determined on that would accommodate what he wanted to have in there. He very famously said he had 3 chairs, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, 3 for company.
Very symbolic.
Society, not company, excuse me. So that was the extent of it. He also said, though, in another chapter, he described having at one time as many as 20 souls and their bodies in the cabin.
Oh.
And we're pretty sure that he refers at that time to an anti-slavery meeting that he helped host on the shores of Walden Pond in August 1846. That's the only time we can imagine that that many people would have actually been at one time in his cabin.
You sent me some information to review ahead of our conversation, and I was struck by the 3 chairs only because in teaching art appreciation and art making, I'm always looking for inroads for students to understand the art or to better perceive it. And symbolism is one of those really nice ways. When an artist provides you with visible symbolism, I'm assuming this happens in literature too,
Sure.
it's a really nice way to get the student into the story or into the narrative or into the concept if it's visual art. And it makes me think of a project I just finished, which reminds me of our trip and reminds me of you and the things I've learned from you and the things I've learned about Thoreau through you, which is this idea of only having what you need and this idea of living more simply and deliberately. And that makes me think of this resurgence of the visible mending movement, where people now, everyday people, instead of when your jeans rip, instead of getting rid of them, they're fixing them. But they're not fixing them to hide the rip. They're fixing them in an artful way to highlight what has been done to this pair of pants or a sweater, and using a different color or putting something decorative on top of that. And so this idea of visibly mending to show the world that I'm keeping this thing because it's of value and I don't need more. And so I just did that literally with my grandmother's desk that she gave me when she died, and I knew I'd be getting the desk because she put a piece of masking tape under it with my name on it the day I was born, because her things were very important to her, and of course of a different generation. And you bought a desk and you kept that desk forever. And the interesting thing about the desk is that it had already been mended. When I got it and I could see it closely in my own home, in my own space, someone, presumably my great uncle, had fixed it numerous times, but he was not a carpenter. And so the fixes are visible, but not in the same way I was speaking of. They're visible because his craftsmanship was not good. And so not that long ago, my children and I, my 2 small kids and I, were having a dance party in the living room, which we do a lot, just to get the wiggles out. And one of them lost control and fell over into the desk and chipped a piece off of a shelf that resides near the bottom. And it was, you don't know how you harbor grief until it hits you again. It's not just a matter of time and it's gone. Something else reminds you of that and it all comes back. And so when that desk broke, I lost my grandmother all over again. And so this idea of repairing it in a way through my own artistic practice and making jewelry for that desk. So I made a brooch to visibly mend that cracked part of the desk. And when I was thinking about the 3 chairs and how, who cares what they look like? It was what they symbolize and who should be sitting on them and their function. And how sometimes he would be here alone with 2 empty chairs. And
most of the time.
And that brings me to our current political day in terms of our current president, President Biden, talking about the empty chair left by victims of COVID. So there's just this huge cyclical idea of what objects mean and the stories that they hold. And we're sitting in a structure built by students and faculty because of the written word. And that to me makes me grateful for just the confluence of events, but also just the awareness to see them.
Exactly. And the historical dimension of Walden, like the artistic, is you can do the same thing. When you talk about the 3 chairs, students will inevitably ask, well, who would he consider friendship for the 2nd chair? When did it become society? And so who were his visitors those 2 years, 2 months and 2 days? And when? And how did he react toward them? And it leads them into all kinds of conversations about who he would have considered friend versus society, and who lived close enough in Walden to make that trek. For instance, Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, recorded in his own journal that he visited here every, I think, Sunday for an entire winter season in the second year. So we have those records documenting and confirming and adding to what Thoreau talked about. So all of the humanities and arts are, coalescing in some really interesting ways in these chapters. The other thing that is so suggestive for our students about Walden is his notion of economy. And so that, again, comes back to shelter and the size of the cabin being small for a reason, big enough to provide the shelter and the heat and the coverage that he needed from, the cold winter and the weather, but at the same time completely conforming to the overall philosophy of simplicity. And that, he says early in Walden that I think this book is, the best audience for this book is poor students. Oh. And my students, of course, today still appreciate that.
Yes.
Because he's constantly pushing at the idea of what we consider the necessaries of life. Mm-hmm. And why do you think you need that car? Why does it need to be that car? Why do you need those clothes?
Yes.
He very famously, you can boil his entire notion of cost down to one of my favorite phrases. I'm going to read it because I don't want to get it wrong. And he says, the cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it. Now, that's not revolutionary. That's not something that any of the economists of the day or since have said, oh, wow, Thoreau was a great economist. And yet the entire first third, one chapter of this famous book is called Economy, because that's what he was at pains to get us to understand, is what he meant by simplicity, and still suggesting that to students who grow up with this same expectations we always have, that your parents, your institutions, your authorities, whoever provides your guidance, is handing you the manual of life.
Yeah. And
it's very seldom, I think for most of us, or for our students, that someone looks at you, especially an adult whom you might admire and respect, and says, you figure it out. Just because I've done it this way, or the church or the school or the teacher or your parents say to do it this way, doesn't mean it's your way. And especially that's what Thoreau's getting at. He's never saying you should go build a cabin and live in the woods.
No.
His, to be frank, white privilege
Yes.
allowed him to build this cabin with friends on property owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson and to squat there for over 2 years. He paid Waldo Emerson back by being the handyman in his home in countless months and years when Waldo wasn't there. But all the same, the opportunity to do what he did was not a common one with a Harvard education behind it.
Sure.
And our students get that. And they really start understanding the notion of trade-offs. That if I didn't buy this, or if I was willing to accept a standard of living this way, then what would I be giving up? What is the amount of my time, the amount of my life that I'm giving in order to have that? And do I need that?
Is it worth it? It's a constant kind of judgment of the worth of something.
Definitely he would think that our modern society does not allow the time that he was insisting he needed to be able to do what he called live.
And he lived here for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days.
Correct.
Why that exact amount of time?
Well, to quote him, he had more lives to live. The practical reason was that I mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson, a close friend, and Ralph Waldo Emerson was heading off to Europe for a second lecture tour, and because Thoreau was a close family friend and had filled the role before of living in his home and sort of being a stand-in father and handyman around the place when Ralph Waldo Emerson was gone, he had been invited to do it again. And again, he had lived there the amount of time that it took to prove to himself that this experiment in living, this experiment in deliberative, considered, mindful, being alone, solitude could happen. He also undertook a book writing project when he went to Walden. That was a big um, motivator because his brother had died and tragically by tetanus just a few years earlier. And he wanted to devote the time of being alone to write a book memorializing him by writing about a river trip that they had taken, a 2-week river trip up the Concord and Merrimack rivers. And so the book was largely drafted by the end of that, 2 years as
So
well.
there was a project.
So there was a project.
It was his own residency. He set up his own writer's residency.
Good point. Yeah,
Yes.
that's a good way to look at it. And had copious notes and journal entries and the beginnings of a draft for what became Walden.
Yes.
It went through, I believe, 8 drafts and was not published then until 1854. He left the pond in 1847.
Okay.
Thoreau was not a creative artist, other than a literary artist, certainly, but not a visual artist. But he certainly was an environmental ethicist, and really considered the father of environmentalism, what became the modern environmentalist movement. That was always coupled with social activism, in his case particularly the anti-slavery movement. I mean, obviously his famous essay, Civil Disobedience, arose to defend a night in jail for not paying his tax that was completely philosophically opposed to the spread of slavery as a result of the Mexican War. So the way in which the environmental ethic, the natural historian, really the observing scientist that seems disconnected from the guy who wrote Civil Disobedience or Slavery in Massachusetts, it's completely of a piece. That reform ethic, that sense of justice for the natural world and our place in it, as well as something as grand in his world as slavery. I think it's important to put those bifurcated notions of who Henry Thoreau was back together, and scholars have been taking a lot of pains to do that.
More recently.
Yeah, I would say over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's really been an important project for a lot of the whole field of eco-criticism, which Ian Marshall at our campus was a great scholar of. That's one of the things they've been looking at Thoreau for, not just calling him the father of nature writing, but the pioneer nature writer perhaps, but look at this social justice, marching not on the front lines, but catching up and getting there once he saw what was at stake.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for this.
As you know, I can go down rabbit holes and talk about this
No,
forever.
But it's nice to look at it through different lenses. The lenses of it happening. I mean, for a moment I forgot where I was. We could have been anywhere talking.
Sure.
But at the same time, like, this is rooted at Penn State Altoona, which is, we're lucky for that.
We are.
But also just this idea of looking at these challenges through an artistic lens at a time where everyone has less connection one-to-one through COVID, and how people are turning to art to fill kind of those voids, either through entertainment, film, and video, and the things they see on their phones, but also just really kind of digging deeper into expressing themselves and celebrating the expression of other people. And I think there is this resurgence of looking to the artist as a mirror to society to see how best to talk about some of these things in a way that is digestible to the public. And it's more than just the recording of data. It really is this reflection and then supplement of emotion and feeling and activity, and it's an exciting time to be a part of a project like this. So that's what I appreciate about you, Sandy, is just your passion and your consistency, and the excellence that you uphold for your students. It's palpable, and I think it makes me want to be a better teacher and a better thinker. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's a privilege to be your colleague.